the record button. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to kick this off. So welcome everybody to this afternoon's seminar. My name is Mike Madison. I am a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh. I do work in law and technology, and I am the host of this series and host of today's workshop. I should be sure to give credit for hosting and sponsoring the workshop to the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. So they are the very generous underwriters of each of the speakers, and they also supply all of the technology resources to allow this to be brought to all of us virtually. Welcome to all of you. I see some familiar names and faces from colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm also seeing names of people that I don't recognize at all. So thank you all for joining us today from wherever you may be. I want to introduce our speaker, Teresa Scassa. Professor Scassa is a Canada Research Chair in Law at the University of Ottawa, where she studies law and technology. She and I first got acquainted a little over a couple of years ago, where we were both speakers at a law and technology conference in Tilburg in the Netherlands. And we hit it off in many respects, including our intellectual interests. And so in putting together this seminar series on law technology, I was happy to invite her to join us and present a work in progress. Her talk is called the Surveillant University. So I think it's especially of interest to academics of all sorts, at all ranks, of all types. She's got a set of slides, so I think we'll bring that up in a moment. She'll give a presentation for give or take 25 minutes or so till about half past the hour, and then we'll have questions. I'll moderate a Q&A after that, and we'll wind up at the top of the next hour. So with that, Teresa, if you're able to bring your slides up.
Yeah.
Okay, I will hand it over to you.
Great. So I'm just going to get this going in the slideshow. Yeah, thank you very much, Michael, for the invitation to be part of this seminar series and for that introduction. Thinking back on when we first met, it was back in those days when you actually could go to events in person, and I feel very nostalgic for those days. My presentation is titled The Surveillant University, and I'm going to apologize in advance for some fairly text-heavy slides. I'm going to try to move fairly quickly through them because I want to get to the discussion part and hear your input and views, but I will go through them quickly, but if there's anything on them that you see you want to talk about more later, certainly feel free to note that. So to put this in a little bit of context, the COVID-19 pandemic brought on a sudden surge in the uptake of remote proctoring by universities around the world. And so in March 2020, WHO declares the COVID-19 pandemic. Universities around the world suddenly have to shift to online learning. It's mid-semester. There are exams coming. The professors have not had time to plan their course around being online only, and there has to be some solution for all of those courses that are exam-based. And so universities move very quickly to adopt remote proctoring solutions in this context. And there's, I just have some data from EDUCA's survey here from April 2020, where 70% of the universities that responded from Canada and the US indicated that they had already subscribed or were planning to use online proctoring services as part of their pandemic response. And the data about just the rise in business that all of the different proctoring companies experienced is quite remarkable. At the same time, there was a lot of resistance, and there continues to be resistance by students. And so I just want to note that that this was, on the one hand, massive adoption of these technologies, on the other hand, resistance ranging from an attempt by students at the University of Amsterdam to get an injunction to prevent their university from using these services, to a range of different complaints and inquiries that were made, student petitions all around the world, and many student petitions at different universities, social media and news reporting, different faculties or universities making choices to refuse to participate, and many professors simply changing their evaluation methods for courses to avoid the exam. So there were many different forms of resistance that took place. I just want to make a couple of caveats before I get into the meat of the presentation. I've said it in the context of the pandemic, and the pandemic led to this massive uptake, but it's not just a pandemic story. Remote proctoring predated the pandemic and was used in quite a number of different contexts, and its use is going to continue after the pandemic, possibly in expanded ways and contexts. So the pandemic was a contributing factor to just raising the profile of the issues, but it is not uniquely a pandemic story. And it's not just a university story. Remote proctoring is used in high schools. It's used for professional certification exams, for bar exams, in all kinds of different contexts. And so many of the same issues arise in those contexts as well. There are a lot of different ways to approach the legal issues related to the surge and uptake of remote proctoring solutions in universities driven by the pandemic. Could write about the normalization of invasive technologies as a result of the pandemic, could focus on AI monitoring and its perils and pitfalls. It's possible to focus on the complexity of mounting legal challenges to the adoption and use of these types of technologies. What I decided to focus on was on the institutional decision to adopt and implement these solutions. In other words, I'm interested in essentially not the technology itself or the company recourse against the company that makes the technology, but I'm looking at the institutions that adopt the technologies and what their process is or should be when they choose to adopt these types of technologies. And I choose to use a necessity and proportionality analysis. It took me a while to get to that point in doing this research, in part because well, I was trying to find the right frame to look at it. And there are a couple of things that I noticed. One is that there are many different legal issues. So you can't just approach this as a privacy question or a discrimination question or a data protection question, because it has dimensions of all of those. So that was one challenge. Another challenge was that it was global. And so I could write about a Canadian response to it, or a Canadian and a US response, but I think that I was looking for some sort of frame that was more global. And so I chose the necessity and proportionality analysis from human rights law, which I think is very helpful. And after the fact also, and I'll just throw this out for those of you who are interested in AI governance, I think in many ways, the analysis maps onto the kinds of considerations that you see in good AI governance policies, which most universities don't have at this stage, but should probably have. So what is remote proctoring? There are many different companies on the market, in the market for remote proctoring services. I've listed some names. There are others as well. So that it's an area of big business and there's lots of competition. An EDUCAUSE survey in 2020 identified 4 main categories of remote proctoring, and I list them here because I think it's important. A lot of the attention has been focused on AI-enabled remote proctoring, and while I think that's important, it's important also not to forget that there's lots of different dimensions to remote proctoring, and so it ranges from passive monitoring of software that students use on their computers during exams, to the lockdown browser type software that some computer-enabled exams have used, to the recording of students on webcams, to live proctors. So there's all of these different types that also now include AI-enabled proctoring. Identity verification is part of most of these proctoring services. And these categories can be mixed and matched. So you can have all 4, you can have a combination of these things in any proctoring service. AI-enabled proctoring adds another dimension to remote proctoring. It amplifies the intensity of the surveillance. It automates detection of cheating type behaviors. It includes identity verification, where the student's face is scanned and compared to an identity document. It can use analysis of both audio and video to detect a variety of movements or activities that are considered suspicious, including unusual noises. Suspicious incidents are flagged for review, and we'll talk a little bit more about that review later. And then based on that review, the host institution can trigger disciplinary processes, and that data is also recorded and stored, which is another important feature. So to get to the necessity and proportionality framework, I've mentioned a little bit why I was motivated to adopt this approach. And I'll just mention, in addition to that, that the public dimensions of universities, for me, support the use of this kind of framework. And you know, you may be sitting there thinking, wow, she's really old school and the world has changed and she's not with it at all, right? Because I do think of you, I feel very fondly about universities. I feel that there's a social and moral responsibility that universities have. They have a role to play within the community. Universities need to show leadership in ethics, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And universities need to champion the values of intellectual honesty and intellectual freedom. And so part of my choice then of this human rights-based framework for determining whether remote proctoring should be adopted in universities is built on that concept of the university as occupying that special place in society. Now, the necessity and proportionality analysis asks two broad questions. The first is the adoption of some form of remote proctoring actually necessary? So there's a requirement to show that there was a need to do this. And secondly, are the measures chosen proportional to the demonstrated need? So it's a pretty simple framework. In terms of whether the measures necessary to achieve a sufficiently pressing and important objective, all that's required is for it to be reasonably necessary in the circumstances. The party introducing it doesn't have to show that it was essential, that you know, nothing could happen unless this was done. It just that it was reasonably necessary in the circumstances. And necessity can also take into account urgent circumstances like the pandemic. And so, for example, there was public health guidance published in Canada early in the COVID-19 pandemic that suggested that universities should think about remote proctoring as a mitigation strategy to put in place social distancing at universities. There was, I mentioned earlier, the injunction brought by University of Amsterdam students against Proctorio, against the use of Proctorio. And in that case, the court declined to issue the injunction, finding that the adoption of Proctorio was necessary in the circumstances to address the need for exam invigilation during the pandemic. And again, that was at the front end of the pandemic. I think one of the things to think about with urgent circumstances is, you know, if your necessity and proportionality analysis is conducted in the context of urgent circumstances, what happens when those circumstances are less urgent or have changed? And do you have to redo the analysis and really think about it? In terms of necessity, the argument in favor of remote proctoring is essentially, when exams go online, the need to ensure exam integrity in student evaluations. And so as part of my research, I looked at the literature that's out there on cheating at university. It was actually depressing. It was a very depressing part of the research because there's a lot of evidence that students cheat. And that they cheat a lot, perhaps more in undergraduate than in other contexts, but nonetheless, the rates of cheating are quite high. Now, there are limitations in the research. It's not as comprehensive as it could be. It relies considerably on self-reporting. The data on cheating sometimes doesn't separate between cheating on assignments and essays versus cheating on exams. But nonetheless, there's still a great deal of evidence that students cheat. Academic integrity is also a core tenet of the fabric of higher education. And there are concerns that cheating at university can have an adverse impact on society. For example, if universities are graduating people with credentials that they haven't actually earned, it can also devalue the credentials of those who don't cheat. And this is something we actually hear from students who are angry or frustrated if there isn't proctoring or surveillance, who say, I don't cheat, and I don't want my grades to be, you know, considered on a par with students who have cheated. Or like, I want something in place to give greater value or worth to my grades. And of course, another indication of necessity is the fact that most universities already have regulations in place and have had them for a long time to address cheating in the university context. And so just to mention briefly that the evidence also shows that cheating is particularly problematic in online environments, that unless measures are put in place to control cheating in online environments, the research suggests that this is seen by students as a license to cheat. So that there's this difference in perception between in-person exams and online exams. So that's a quick survey of the evidence around necessity. And certainly, you know, in the University of Amsterdam case, there was no difficulty in establishing for the court that there was a necessity to introduce remote online proctoring. The more important question, though, is proportionality. And there we have to ask whether the adopted measure is proportional to the demonstrated need. Has it been properly adapted to the circumstances? Does it minimally impair the rights at issue? And as I mentioned before, you know, urgency may be a consideration at one point in time, but after the urgency, those questions have to be considered as well. And I thought what I'd do is just mention briefly at the outset some of the different interests that are affected by remote proctoring, because I mentioned earlier that there's a complex collection of interests there, or rights that are at issue. One of them is data protection, which I distinguish from privacy, and data protection really relates to the laws that set the rules and conditions for the collection and use of personal data. There have already been data breaches involving remote proctoring services. So, you know, the risk of data breach is there. It always is with companies that collect data. And there's also reason to be concerned about the potential for a lucrative secondary market for data about students, and the potential that that data might be exploited. And there's an excellent article, I provide the link here, that talks about these secondary markets for data about students. So data protection is clearly an important issue. Privacy, considered in terms of individual dignity and autonomy, is also important. Some remote proctoring options place students under constant and direct surveillance, either by human or through recording combined with or without AI. But that is a very different level of intensity of surveillance. The AI-enabled systems can flag head and eye movements, changes in typing speed, and concerns about triggering a flag just because when you think you look at the ceiling, you know, or whatever the case may be, can really enhance anxiety on the part of students. And anxiety is obviously a problem with test taking, and there's evidence that links online and remote proctoring with increased levels of anxiety, and anxiety is also linked to lower test performance. So anxiety is, and its contribution to anxiety is fairly significant. With this software, bathroom breaks may be prohibited or limited, and this can be a real issue in general for students. And there have been a number of anecdotal reports of how this has proven really problematic for students. And of course, recordings include recordings of students' private spaces, and many students have flagged this as something that is particularly invasive for them. Discrimination issues are also really important. Issues of discrimination arise in different ways with remote proctoring. I've mentioned anxiety. So for students who suffer from anxiety, they may be put at a disadvantage with remote proctoring. Women may be more uncomfortable with live one-on-one proctoring, and there is anecdotal evidence. For example, the live one-on-one is where you are writing your exam and there's somebody on the other end of the video camera who's watching you the whole time you're writing your exam. There are also reports that some women have run into difficulties with requirements to remove head coverings at the identification stage. Now, some companies will provide women proctors, female proctors who will step in those circumstances. But if they aren't able to, if they have a shortage of women proctors, then there have been, again, anecdotal reports that women who wear head coverings have been unable to proceed with the exam because of this barrier. Some students have disabilities or medical conditions that lead to movements or behaviors being flagged as suspicious by proctors or by AI monitoring. Universities sometimes tell these students, well, that you can request accommodation. But the problem with this, of course, is that students are then required to medically document conditions that they have and disclose those to university when those conditions don't actually impact their ability to perform the actual evaluation. They just impact their ability to perform an AI-enabled remote proctoring, an evaluation that is proctored by AI. And so there is resistance to that as well. I've mentioned the bathroom breaks issue, and one study done in 2020 noted that 26% of institutions use some remote proctoring products that don't meet their accessibility standards, and 8% did no accessibility vetting at all. There's also issues around racial discrimination. Some Black students have been required to change their exam writing locations or the lighting of the rooms at the outset of exams because face detection software could not function properly otherwise. You can imagine you're nervous, you're at the start of an exam, and then you're being told that you cannot start the exam until you get yourself in a different room or change the lighting. And I mean, that's very disruptive. There's also evidence that affect recognition tools incorporate racial bias, and the AI-enabled proctoring, obviously, in particular, uses affect recognition in some circumstances. There may also be issues with the human in the loop who determines which flagged incidents are significant. And this is an implementation issue in particular. I'll talk more about it in a minute, but I think this is a really interesting and challenging issue for universities. Students with low socioeconomic status who live in rural or remote locations who face constraints such as close quarter living spaces or childcare obligations may also run into difficulties with remote proctoring. So those are all issues that have been flagged, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about the impact of those issues. In terms of minimally impairing implementations, there are different things universities can do, of course. Remote proctoring can be mandatory or it can be optional as long as realistic alternatives are provided. So that may be something to consider. Choices can be made that eliminate the elements that are most problematic or unacceptable. It's possible to consider alternative strategies, and many professors have done that. And of course, transparency and consultation is also a part of a minimally impairing implementation. Harder to do in an urgent situation, easier to do in a non-urgent situation where you actually are transparent about what you're thinking about doing, and you have consultation and you get input. In terms of data protection, I won't go through all of this because I certainly want to save time for discussion, but I want to highlight a couple of things. So in Canada, we have universities are subject to public sector data protection laws, and these public sector data protection laws actually conflict or with remote with the general terms and conditions of remote proctoring. And so universities have had to adopt campus-wide subscriptions in order to negotiate with the companies for different rules of different data protection rules with respect to the information that's collected through remote proctoring. So that's an interesting issue. In terms of the campus-wide subscription, in the United States in particular, many schools went with student paid service. In other words, students had to register with the chosen proctoring company and pay per exam for the proctoring, which meant that the students had to provide their identity information to the company and had to provide credit card information and other data. So you can see that depending on how you choose to do this, you can have different data protection implementations and implications. The data that are collected by the university and the proctoring service need to be taken into account. Is it identity and payment data? What kind of biometric data is collected? Is it audio and video data, keystroke data? There's lots of different data that can be collected depending on what implementation is chosen. Another issue that I want to flag here is who accesses the data. And again, who at the proctoring company gets access to the data, who at the university has access to the data, how do you set the parameters in terms of and conditions around that access? And those are important issues as well. And there are certainly choices that can be made that aren't always made. And as I mentioned, the separately negotiated agreements, and this would be the case in Europe as well with the GDPR, the separately negotiated agreements between universities and proctoring companies can offer a higher level of data protection for students. In terms of privacy and discrimination, of course, there are issues around how the risks and impacts of discrimination are assessed and addressed, what accommodations are made for students, under what circumstances are they unduly burdensome, and what's the relationship between anxiety and the intensity of the surveillance in those particular circumstances. In terms of the implementation of remote proctoring, there's a lot of interesting questions for universities. For example, who sets the surveillance parameters for an exam? There are different surveillance parameters for an exam that can be set with these remote proctoring services. And so it can be determined, the categories that are permitted can be determined by the university, and they can be limited, or they can be left to individual professors to determine. So there's an important question to think about, right? You know, what parameters are you going to set on surveillance? Is the room checked only once, or is the room recorded throughout the whole of the exam writing period? How are flagged incidents addressed and by whom? This is really important and really, I think, an interesting question. Many universities, so if you're using AI-enabled surveillance, there'll be flags when there are suspicious activities. And AI-enabled surveillance can generate a whole number, many flags, most of which are trivial. Student stares up at the ceiling, student stares off to the side. It's not cheating, it's just staring into space. We all do it, right? So there can be many flags. Many universities delegated the responsibility for reviewing flags to instructors. Instructors didn't have the time to review all those flags. Aren't you going to watch all of those videos, look at all of those different flags that are raised, and universities, if they don't provide additional resources, then, who looks at the flags? But if those resources are provided, who's looking at the flags then? Are they peers? Are they student research assistants? Anyway, raises a lot of interesting issues. ProctorU, one of the companies, found that only about 11% of test sessions that were tagged for suspicious activity by AI tools were reviewed by the school or testing authority. As a result, it decided to change its practices, and it no longer offered proctoring services, AI-enabled remote proctoring services, without providing its own humans in the loop. In other words, the reviews were done by the company because they were not comfortable that the universities were actually doing those reviews. And that's a huge issue. So what does that mean? You put the students through all that surveillance and then nobody looks at the flags? Or does it mean every flag leads to a student having to justify their conduct? I mean, what are the implications of that? The other thing about the flags is whether there's a procedure in place for university to collect and audit data, including flagged incidents, those sent for discipline, those dismissed, and disciplinary outcomes, in order to assess how this remote proctoring is functioning, whether it is creating differences in treatment of certain categories of students, whether there's bias and discrimination, whether, what are the outcomes. And I want to note here again with the flags and the review of flags, which is very interesting. If you download it to the instructor to review the flags, then what does that mean in terms of biases that the instructor may bring to the flagging, to the review of those flags? Do they, being very busy, look at the flagged videos and say, oh, they're a good student, they came to all the classes, I'm not going to look at those flags, that's probably just nothing. But this student was annoying or obnoxious, didn't like them, I'm going to look at their flags. Does racial bias enter into that? Does gendered bias enter into that? What does quarterback of the football team enter into that, right? You're not going to look at those flags because you just don't want to go down that road. So I think that there's some really interesting questions that need to be asked about technology that flags for the human in the loop and who that human is and what guidance they follow. And so, of course, transparency becomes tremendously important in that context. There are alternatives. I've mentioned that some professors changed their modes of evaluations. Some used technology to develop unique tests for each student. Some used gallery view Zoom proctoring. So there was a remote surveillance, but it was one person looking at a screen of 30 people, for example. So nobody was under constant gaze. And of course, whether you record or don't record becomes important in that context. Some universities have announced that they've ended the use of AI-enabled proctoring. And I'll give you a couple of examples there, but there are some universities who, after their experience with it, have said, we're not doing this anymore, and it's not, we've just discontinued use of those services. And so just to wrap up, and maybe to set us up for some discussion, some of the questions that I raise in this context are, to what extent does the university context factor into the necessity and proportionality analysis. In other words, is the calculation of necessity and proportionality different for something like a bar exam or other professional certification than it is from a university? Am I justified in thinking that universities are a context in which we have to take particular care with this kind of technology? Are risks to privacy, data protection, and human rights too high for AI-enabled proctoring? Are there any measures that we could put in place that would make it acceptable, or is it simply something that should be off the table? And this is related to the next question, which is the goal of university proctoring to deter cheating or to stamp it out, right? If the goal is to stamp it out and catch every possible incident, then maybe amplifying the level of surveillance is appropriate. But if the goal is to deter cheating and to encourage honest behavior as part of some kind of educational process, then maybe it's not an appropriate solution or technology. And so my final question, what does proportional remote proctoring look like? So I'll stop it there. You don't have to answer my questions. I'm happy to answer yours, or we can have a discussion about anyone's questions, but I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Oh, fantastic. Teresa, thank you so much. Very, very, very provocative things. So I've got 1,000 questions myself, but I want to hold off and initially invite anyone who would like to raise your hand using the function in Zoom, and I'll just call on people in sequence. People have questions? Give people a chance to reflect. Okay. Well, I'll lead off with a question. I'm going to pick up on one of the themes in your last slide, Teresa, which is, are universities special? Right. I mean, I have my own personal instincts on this point. I've written about it in some respects. You touched on some of the points. But I worry that we sort of indulge this very romanticized instinct about the role of universities in society, and we don't, as scholars and researchers or critics, we're not sufficiently appreciative of the fact that in many respects, universities have simply become certifying authorities. Right, we provide diplomas. The diploma is a unit of currency in the job market, and that's kind of the function, the kind of neoliberal capitalist function, to be very rhetorically dramatic about it, that we've become. And so there's a sense in which the technologies that you're describing are consistent with kind of the modern functioning of universities rather than inconsistent with their more idealized versions. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and it's one that I do, yeah, it's one I question myself about, because like you, I come with this instinct that we're trying to do something different in a university. Growing body evidence to the contrary sometimes. But I still do see universities as places where we do have arguments and discussions about, about values, about social values, and where we work hard to ensure equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I think I'm still going to cling to this idea that universities are special places. But I agree with you, and I think there is a risk with this particular type of technology, that it does play to certain values and certain approaches. The other risk that I see in this context is something like the pandemic and the widespread uptake of the technology starts to normalize it. And we were talking earlier before the talk about the lockdown browser software, which has been around for a while, and many universities have been using it and has kind of been more normalized. And there are aspects of remote surveillance that are already somewhat normalized in the university context. And so so there is that risk as well, that it's just it's just a matter of time, and we'll get over these feelings of discomfort, and we will just adapt to this. And that really concerns me, both within the university context and within society more generally. Excellent.
Thank you. Isadora, please introduce yourself and where you are, where you're logging in from, and then we'll have your question.
Hi, yes. Sorry, I think the video is disabled, so I will just be a ghostly voice for now. Thank you very much for this talk. I am a political science PhD candidate at McGill, and I study attitudes towards mass surveillance in advanced democracies. So this talk was really interesting to me. I'm not a law student, but I think an area of overlap between political science and law is the question of consent. And I was wondering if you could speak to how students, especially this example you gave of the license that American universities got compared to Canadian ones, where students had to buy access to the proctorial services. If there's an argument to be made about the way in which consent is structured in educational settings, none of us consent to the particulars of whether our university uses Microsoft, right? And so our ethics boards require us to disclose certain things, but that doesn't usually involve saying, you know, everything will be stored in a Microsoft server, right? So those kinds of things of consent, I'm really interested to hear your point of view.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So thank you for that. It's certainly true that there are so many contexts where for example, moving online, all of us started to use Zoom or Microsoft Teams or other platforms for teaching and for meetings and so on. And it was just as a matter of course, we had to use them, even though these are private sector companies that do collect data and collect and use the data in a variety of different ways. Consent isn't very, individual free and informed consent isn't very realistic in those contexts because, you know, we have to teach our classes and we have to go to meetings and we more or less have to conform to the platforms that other people have chosen. And so, you know, that's been part of it. And we see this in the high schools and elementary schools where the school boards adopt, you know, platforms and educational software, and children, and from the private sector, and, you know, children are required to use it. And you know, so there's so many different ways in which our ability to consent with respect to many of these technologies that are used in the educational context and that collect our personal data is very limited, and we haven't fruitfully had those discussions. And I think in some cases we haven't had them because it's very hard to see what the alternatives, whether there are any realistic alternatives for universities for some of these sorts of things. But yeah, that is, you know, that's a big issue. You know, the amount of personal data we just give up on simply because we have to use a whole range of communication technologies in order to do our jobs and in order to participate at school and all of those sorts of things. So I do think that's is a really important issue. And then of course, when you add the remote proctoring software, it's another layer of consent. There is a way to manage it to some extent between the individual and the collective license. And there still are data protection implications with the collective license, but they are at least better than they are with the individual license. And so, you know, so maybe it's a question of the lesser of two evils. I'm not sure. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but.
Thank you.
Additional questions? So Teresa, I guess I have one of my follow-ups is at a much more concrete level than my original question, which was a much more sort of values-based thing. And it picks up on the part of your concluding slide that asked questions about who's responsible for the different decisions in different parts of these systems. And I wondered if you, in your research, had detected any patterns or common practices in the sort of allocation of responsibility for a lot of these, anything from the default settings in terms of the application of a particular technology, all the way up to the decision whether to acquire and deploy the technology in the first place. I'm particularly interested as an academic in the line between responsibility lying with the faculty or with an individual instructor, as opposed to responsibility being delegated by default to an administrative function, such as a central IT department or even an IT department within a faculty or a school. there's a set of sort of on the ground trade-offs associated with that, but between the pandemic and other trends in technology, there's a sort of a centralization of technology functions that I think you see a lot, especially in larger universities. Services in the cloud managed centrally. The departments or the faculties are sort of clients of the central service provider, which means that a lot of the practical responsibility for these technology-based decisions lives in an IT department as opposed to living in, with the academic staff at any, whether it's a senior or a junior or a graduate student level. So I wonder if you detected any patterns. It might vary a lot from university to university or from country to country, but I just wondered if you'd had any perspective on that.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting questions. And we did try to dig into university policies around the adoption of the technologies. So I think that, a few things. One is, I think this would be a very fruitful area for further research and digging, because I do think there are some really interesting questions here about the specific ways in which universities made decisions about these technologies. We ran into issues around transparency. And I think, and I'm not sure to what extent those were transparency issues that were dictated by pandemic circumstances. In other words, this was just taken up really quickly and nobody thought through these issues or consulted, and nobody had, prepared and so things just happened. And then, you have the risk of the status quo. So I'm not sure how much of it was affected by that. But we saw a lot of the public information that was posted by universities about their practices that didn't get into a lot of detail about choices that were made or how the software particularly worked, or that referred students to the company websites themselves for details about privacy and data protection. So we didn't see a lot of particular detail. There was a little bit more with respect to the particularly negotiated agreements that universities in Canada had in order to comply with the public sector legislation. So they provided a little bit more detail. But overall, transparency, I think, was a big issue here. So, I think freedom of information requests might be an avenue to pursue. Attempts to get more information or details about what was actually done would be very useful here. Because I do think those questions are important about who's making those decisions and why they're making those decisions, whether they're just going to defaults. Those are all really important questions, and they're ones that should have been considered, and they're ones that should have, I think, been consulted on with faculty. But that didn't seem to happen in a lot of these cases, or if it did happen, there's not a lot of evidence of it actually happening.
Yeah. And I think it's complicated, something that you didn't talk on directly, but it's sort of implied in part by the question that Isadora asked, and I'm looking at her supplemental comment in the chat, by the fact that a number of these, I wouldn't call them proctoring technologies, but I would call them sort of student surveillance technologies, are not necessarily standalone programs, but they may be baked into other technologies for student support in other respects. So Canvas, as one of the really, really big learning management systems out there, Canvas has a lot of features that, if they're activated, capture a lot of detailed information about student engagement with course material, whether they're related to assessments or not related to assessments. But as an instructor, if you choose to, under certain circumstances, you can really pay a lot of close attention to students. And the students are very much not aware, unless it's affirmatively disclosed in some respects, that all of this is possible. Now, those features may not be turned on. The university may have acquired a Canvas license and may have rolled out Canvas without fully developing the capabilities to take advantage of all those functions. So there's this question of transparency has this sort of ongoing potential salience in addition to mid-semester or end of semester assessments, where these proctoring choices that you've been focusing on So I guess there's a question in all of this, which is sort of how broadly does your framework and perspective here actually go? I mean, you've picked a case, which is particularly salient, but again, this is my law professor instinct that says, like, how much do you want to generalize beyond this case to the application of your framework to other kinds of technology uses across the university campus?
Yeah, that's a really, that's an interesting question. And so part of that is perhaps I think you can distinguish it in some cases because this is exam taking, and the consequences are very significant, both in terms of, if it's causing additional anxiety and affecting your performance and therefore your grade, that's a significant consequence. If you're flagged for cheating and you have to defend yourself in a disciplinary proceeding, that's incredibly agonizing, and therefore that's a consequence if you're found to have cheated. All of these sorts of things are significant consequences. So you can distinguish it in that sense. But at the same time, you're absolutely right that there are other contexts in which we have introduced, without a lot of conscious thought, surveillance technologies for our students. We use Brightspace at the University of Ottawa, and I was taken aback when I went into my Brightspace course page at one point and discovered that I could have access to all kinds of information about the extent, about when and how my students logged in and what things they were looking at and so on, which made me feel very uncomfortable. But it was simply automatic. Nobody asked me if I wanted to know those things. And nobody told my students that those things would be known about them, not just in my course, but in all of their online courses. And so I actually suspect that that's not compliant with data protection law unless they, unless there was some sort of policy that they signed on to that they didn't read and consented to, but nobody has time to read those things. So in any event, there are some really interesting questions about other layers or levels of surveillance that we have within the university and what we do about that. So I'm, not necessarily generalizable across the board, because me knowing whether people are interacting with course materials may have less implication for the students than the surveillance of their exams. And the exam surveillance also brings strangers into their homes and all sorts of other things that go on there. But at the same time, who's to say that the perceptions of a professor are not shaped in some way about their students, who they're going to grade on participation and engagement by what they see in the data for the website. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know, something to think about there.
Yeah, no, I have to be honest, just in my own experience, my reaction to learning about the new capabilities of Canvas when that was rolled out at the University of Pittsburgh is I was completely creeped out by the extent to which I could, if I chose to, observe all kinds of things. And so I opted out. I don't use Canvas, to the horror of many of my sort of teaching support colleagues around the university. I don't use any of the university supplied courseware because I don't want to know all these things. And I don't use Panopto to record classes for the same reason, because that also has built-in surveillance capabilities that I don't even want to be tempted to look at, and I don't want to have to explain to the students what's going on. People have questions. I'm monopolizing the conversation, and I feel badly, but so I'm happy to defer if other people want to raise additional topics. Okay, well, I'll just keep going. I've got an endless supply of questions because it's fascinating to me. I guess, Teresa, when we met in the Netherlands 2.5 years ago, we were at a conference about data governance and data protection. And I remember you were writing then about sidewalk labs and Toronto and smart city stuff, which is a topic that I have since gotten very involved in my Knowledge Commons work. So I'm wondering what drew you to this topic about surveillance in universities and, with the specific application to this remote proctoring software, given what the research trajectory that you had been on previously.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Part of it was, I guess I throughout throughout my work with law and technology, I've actually, and so this is really just a story about just how my brain functions, but I've used deep dives into particular contexts or particular technologies to help me to understand, not just understand, but even see some of the issues that are raised by the technologies. And so Sidewalk Toronto in the smart cities context was kind of the deep dive into Sidewalk Toronto, what was going on there was one way for me to really dig into and think about and understand what was happening in that particular context, but then to be able to generalize out to other forms of smart cities data governance and the issues that are raised in those contexts. And I've done it with a number of other different types of things. And so, when after the pandemic shutdown, when issues started to see so much attention being paid to AI-enabled exam surveillance, I thought, well, this might be an interesting place to sort of dig in and see what there is to see and what there is to learn, and then to think about some of the implications. And I did find that very interesting. And I have to say, one of the things that, one of the places where it led me was from, in terms of an initial focus, it was on the proctoring companies and what the proctoring companies were doing. And I think that's still very interesting. But where I ended up was back to the adoption by the institution and some of the governance issues that and the responsibilities of the adopting institution. So, maybe a link to the Sidewalk Toronto work in that sense, because it's about making choices about the technology to adopt. So it's not all in the hands of the companies creating and generating the technology, but we also have to think about the responsibilities of those who are choosing to adopt and use the technologies. So that's a kind of long, convoluted, that's how my brain works answer.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm looking at the chat. Joe Ewan is asking, making a couple points in the chat about decision making and levels of decision making and the complexities in universities about how things actually get done.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I just want to underline with respect to that, I think, one of the things that I found really interesting that jumped out of this was this idea that the university would adopt the AI-enabled technology that you would get, and then the university would get these, each professor would get these recordings with flags. And then there was this expectation that was not negotiated, because it's an increase in a professor's workload, was not negotiated, that was not discussed. All of a sudden, professors were supposed to review all of these videos and review the flags and make decisions based on those flags about whether to send the students to discipline or not. And there wasn't a lot of attention paid to how to integrate this new technology with disciplinary systems, right? Does a flag with a professor saying, yeah, that looks a little problematic to me, does that immediately require a student to defend themselves? And at what level does it require? In a conversation with the professor first, or in a full disciplinary hearing? Like there's all kinds of breakdowns from the idea, from the moment you adopt the technology to the moment you discipline a student for cheating, all kinds of breakdowns in terms of the kinds of issues that were thought through and put in and worked through. And I think that there wasn't a lot of thinking about that. And certainly the evidence that ProctorU stepped back from just assuming that these flags were going to be reviewed to making sure they were by putting a human in the loop shows that there were assumptions made about how this would work that simply were not realistic assumptions. And so that's very problematic.
Yeah, and you could pay that all down, all the way down the chain, right? You're just putting somebody in the loop in terms of reviewing the results doesn't dictate any particular system for governance, decision-making, adjudication, burdens of proof, let alone, we'll say labor equity in terms of senior professor versus junior professor versus a grad student, and who's actually assigned the laboring or in terms of doing a lot of these work, and how that might vary from field to field, right? So this is going to pay out differently in a humanities department compared to a computer science or an engineering department, compared to a health sciences program of some sort, or professional school, because of course faculty structures and hierarchies will work very differently in different corners of the university. Joe, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I guess my question is, a lot of these issues, or I guess maybe I should say that a lot of the institutions that maybe have come to light more and having issues with this technology would be those institutions that formerly functioned, in person in classrooms. But there's obviously a bunch of programs, remote programs that universities have had, online programs at many levels, mostly I think continuing education and master's programs. I am interested to see, is there an expectation, or are there more conflicts when the expectation was, I'm going to come to university as a student in person, versus those people that have signed up for online courses when it comes to these privacy agreements, or I guess I'm just wondering if the point of view of the student coming into all of this really makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's an interesting question as well. I mean, I certainly think that in the past, these technologies were used in contexts where the students had signed on to do something online and were kind of accepting that this, as you say, these were the rules of the game for doing this online. And there was a sense with university in general that this was not what students had signed up for. So that may explain some of the resistance to it. And many students were also thrust into situations that were really difficult for them, that learning from home and writing exams from home was extremely challenging because their homes were not places where they could adequately do that. And so they might not have chosen to do remote learning and to take an online course if they had that choice, but they were put in that position and they simply didn't have the circumstances or the environment in which they could do that with these technologies. So that was also clearly an issue for many students. So that's an interesting question, but it does also raise the issue of whether whether this was an important moment in terms of focusing pushback, right? Because maybe up until then, people weren't crazy about online surveillance, but felt that they had no choice because they were the ones who signed up for the online course and the online exam. And so it's taken this moment for students to stand up and say, this isn't good. We don't like it. We have all kinds of problems with it. And now you have to pay attention to those problems. And we're going to demand you pay attention to those problems going forward, even after the pandemic, when it's used in these other contexts. So yeah. So it may be, maybe that it's also spurred that kind of resistance that will apply to those other contexts as well.
Okay, Joe Yun, we'll give you the last question for today.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I know we don't have time, but I just wanted to mention, so I'm actually new to Pitt, and I have a dual role where I work for the Office of CIO as an AI architect, and then I'm also ECE research professor. And I've actually kind of flip-flopped from university to university, being faculty or deciding to do more IT, because I like both. But I think I'm in a unique position where I kind of understand the history of how technology and the application of technology has grown out on universities, both from before there was even IT considered, and it was just part of finances or part of HR. And then it kind of went into its own thing. And then it kind of went into each department made their own decisions. And then now we're in this world where the whole enterprise is to make one decision about messaging, or one decision about video conferencing, right? And so the history of how decision making for technology choices really has grown in such an interesting way. But what has not really evolved was the ability for universities to make centralized decisions on things quickly. When it comes to what one college wants versus another college, or one department wants versus another department. And so all this to say, I was fascinated by your presentation and fully on board. I mean, I write a lot about AI ethics, actually. My question is more, into the future, how can university environments where I think if you ask people some of these questions, don't you think this is kind of wrong? Don't you think that this is, we should be talking to people? And I think people would say, of course, right? But then when you say, okay, then how do we decide how to pick a learning management system for campus, right? And how do we follow a due process to take in all these considerations? That's a I would love to understand like a process to figure that out, right? Because I think it's a very unique environment when it comes to technology decision making.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. And I think you're right. It is a unique environment because, and also because on one level, there's a lot of technology decision making that is bureaucratic and institutional. And on another level, there's a lot of decision making around exams and classes and how things are taught that is collegial and collegial and unit based or faculty based, and where the expectation is more participatory, where there are faculty councils that have student representatives and grad student representatives and all of this sort of stuff. So you've got two very different kinds of decision making typically about very different things. And what this has done is it has taken technology decision making and put it in the classroom where you normally have this more collegial kind of decision making. And so I think that that's an interesting phenomenon here. And I don't know what it will involve. I think more, I can't help but think that more participation, transparency, participation, and open discussion is a good thing. Our faculty recently decided for this last round of exams that it was going to allow surveillance only by Zoom, one-to-many Zoom with no recording if professors chose to use it, and there was nothing else that was going to be allowed. And it was interesting to see some students decrying this as surveillance and unacceptable surveillance, even though it's so much better than many of the alternatives. Other students responding angrily saying, I believe that some of my classmates cheat and I want them caught because I don't want somebody getting an A when I'm not getting an A if they're cheating and I'm not. And so surveil the heck out of everybody. And so it was really interesting to me to see these different student perspectives. And I think we need to create spaces where people can have these discussions and make collective decisions, which may surprise people on both sides in terms of what the outcome are, but where we are really trying to work through the issues and make good decisions. So, I think that's, still where I would come out on this, recognizing at the same time that sometimes these decisions have to be made quickly and sometimes they have to be made within certain technological parameters as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry for last question so long.
No, that's excellent. Actually, a great way to end up. So number one, Joe Yoon, welcome to Pittsburgh. Happy to see that the University of Pittsburgh continues to draw on the excellent resources of the University of Illinois. And Teresa, primarily to you in closing, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Super provocative and timely presentation. So I'm sure everybody's going to walk away with a lot of new thoughts to think and to reflect on in their own respective domains, wherever they work and teach or otherwise apply all this stuff. So it's great to be connected. Thank you for being here. A round of applause for you, and look forward to staying in touch. And Joe Marlett, I guess we can cut off the recording at this point. So thank you for your tech support. Teresa?
Thanks very much.